I'm going to be talking about what I've learned over the course of about a year and a half, thinking really hard about what's real about this AI thing, what's hype about this AI thing, and where it is truly going to make a difference. The content is largely drawn from a book I've been writing for the last 18 months or so. Some disclosures, including the one, probably the biggest one, is that I'm on the board of this company. I'm on the board of several other companies that are working somewhat in the AI space. I'm also on the board of the Macy Foundation, which is the only foundation in the country that focuses on medical education. So I've been thinking a lot about the future education of physicians. I advise a bunch of companies as well, in some of them in the AI space. If I mention any of them, and I don't think I will let you know as a disclosure. Okay, so I started my talk last year with this slide. I think it's very important. People, you've probably heard a bunch of AI talks. I have heard a bunch of AI talks. Most of them stink, and most of them stink because they're wildly technical. And I am not a technologist, and this is how I think about AI. I know that there is this math that goes into it. There are all these sort of convolutional models to mirror the way the brain works. There's a bunch of these things. I actually don't know what those are. That is not what I'm going to be talking about here. If you're sitting here worried about, oh my God, AI, I don't get it, how it works. This is the way I think about AI. There's a bunch of math. There's a miracle that occurs. And then there's some math on the far end. I think we can all be in the miracle business. I think it's perfectly fine for you to not really understand what's happening under the hood. It's more important to understand what it is, what it does, where it works, where it screws up. And that's what I'll be emphasizing today. So I'll give you two quotes to get started. One of them is Hemingway's quote from The Sun Also Rises. One of the characters goes bankrupt. Another one says to him, "How does a man go bankrupt?" And the answer famously is two ways: gradually and then suddenly. In healthcare, if you think about the digital transformation of healthcare, I think we have the gradually part down pat. There's been no industry, maybe with the exception of education, that has been as untransformed by technology as healthcare. And there are lots of metrics of it. Think for a minute about it. Is there an Uber or Netflix or Airbnb equivalent in healthcare? I can't think of any. If you look at America's top companies 100 years ago, it was US Steel, it was American Harvester. Those were in the top 10 companies in revenue in the United States. Of course, the top 10 companies now are the ones Richard showed you. None of them existed when I was in high school. If you look at a list of America's top 100 hospitals or top 10 hospitals 100 years ago, it was places like the Mayo Clinic and the Brigham and UCSF, and it's exactly the same list as it is today. There's no other industry where you would say the leading incumbents 100 years ago are still the leading incumbents today. That is remarkable and really a metric of how slowly we have transformed. And I think in some ways the dominant question is the Hemingway question, which is this our suddenly time? Is all of the building blocks, the electronic health record, because you needed the data to be digital, and all of the pressures. This is not just about what the technology does, but the desperate need the healthcare system has for transformation. The fact that in nobody's view is the healthcare system working in the way we need it to work. Is that combination going to create a tipping point? And my premise is yes, not in a kind of silly, it's not going to happen tomorrow or next year, but over a 5 or 10 year time horizon, I think we're going to see the kind of transformation that we're used to as we think about how we do our finances or how we plan travel or how we buy stuff. All of those industries, how we get our entertainment, how we get our news. All of those industries have been transformed by technology. Healthcare, I think, is the exception. I think our time has come. Second quote. This is Gianrico Ferrugia, who is the CEO of the Mayo Clinic, who I had the pleasure of interviewing a year and a half ago. And we were talking about AI and the Mayo Clinic. So Mayo, I'd say, is the most storied brand in healthcare. There are really few national brands in healthcare. Healthcare tends to be local and regional. But Mayo is not only national, it's an international brand. And I said, you must be worried about, he puts on his clothes in the morning and everything has the Mayo Clinic logo on it. It feels like the Pope donning his vestments. Lots of history, lots of tradition, lots of culture. You must be scared of going too fast. And Gianrico said to me, I think the risk of not going fast enough is far greater than the risk of going too fast. It's an interesting balance that you have to have in a very successful organization that has a huge legacy and a lot of focus on history. One more quote I don't have up here, but I like the late Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir once said, "Don't be humble, you're not that great." And so I think it's a risk for very successful companies of sort of Golda Meir syndrome. Okay, so in writing a new talk over the last week, I tried to think what were the 5 big takeaways that I got in this year and a half of deeply immersing myself in this topic and speaking to a lot of very thoughtful people. So here they are. The first is, I think Foroughi is right. I think the risk of going too slow is higher than the risk of going too fast. Doesn't mean being silly about it, doesn't mean just adopting every tool that gets pitched to you, because you'll probably get a lot pitched to you, but I do think the risk of being left behind is quite real here. The second, I will talk about something I did mention last year, but I think it's an important concept for everybody to have as they think about this, which is the productivity paradox of information technology. I'll tell you what that means in a minute, but hint is that it's not all about the technology. Technologies fail lots of times, even though the technology is really spiffy, because it's really about the technology meets humans and culture and people and regulations and payment and all that stuff. So I'll say a few words about that. And I don't think AI is fundamentally different in that regard than other technologies. And why has the experience with the electronic health record been so painful? In part because of that question, because it does what it's supposed to do, doesn't do it supremely well, but it does what it's supposed to do. But when it butted up against this incredibly complex system, it created all sorts of unanticipated consequences. As we were implementing Epic 10 years ago, if you said to me a few years later, physicians' major complaint will be documentation burden, and that they now have become a slave to their computer and they're spending all their time looking down typing, I wouldn't have guessed that, but that in retrospect became obvious. A few years later, documentation burden was no longer their main complaint about their computer. Anybody know what their main complaint about their computer was? The inbox, right? It became the EHR inbox. Why was that not the major complaint in year 1 or 2 or 3? Because the patient portal had not yet rolled out. The patient portal rolls out. Terrific. Patients have this thing that they can use to interact with the health system, and yet it doesn't help them make an appointment or figure out how to interpret this doctor's note that they now have access to. What does it mean my magnesium is low and my EKG is abnormal? And, or pay a bill or do anything. And so the Epic and Cerner and others were nice enough. They put a little button on the thing that says, send a note to your doctor. And lo and behold, patients did it. It's like, duh, of course they're going to do that. Why would they not do that? And it's free. And all of a sudden, that became the major complaint. So these are the sort of things that I don't think anybody anticipated, but became huge issues in every health system and every practice in the country. I'll talk about sort of how to start in your AI journey, and I think that has become clearer. I'll also talk about what the companies are feeling in the AI world, which is that if you solve only a single problem and you are not a platform that solves a lot of problems, you're probably going to be out of business pretty soon. And then finally, I will try to answer the question for you, at least as well as I could answer it. Will there be doctors, and what should I tell my kids if they're thinking about going into medicine? So that's my agenda. We'll go quickly. I'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes for discussion. Why Gianrico Farrugia, the CEO of the Mayo Clinic, was right. This is a big deal. The transformation of our world through AI is faster than any other prior technology. This is the curve of the adoption of various technologies that hit it very big and how long it took to get to 1 million and then 100 million users. And you see even technologies that became as important as Facebook or Netflix took years to get to 100 million users. ChatGPT took 2 months. So we've never seen a technology that had this rapid an adoption curve in the workplace and in people's regular lives. And I asked last year how many of you have not used GPT or Gemini or something, and there maybe half the people raise their hand. I won't embarrass anybody now, because if you haven't, I don't know what rock you're under. But I think by and large, I'm guessing all of you have at least played with these tools at least a little bit by now. And if you're not, you're on a very small island, because pretty much everybody has. Now, one of the things that's been most interesting for me as I've, in the process of writing this book over the course of a couple of years, is watching the evolution of these tools and how quickly they have gotten better and demonstrated their remarkable capabilities. So this timeline, I'll quickly walk you through it. So November 30th, 2022, ChatGPT is introduced publicly, and that's the day I played with it and had kind of my first vertiginous moment of like, holy cow, I ask it to tell me my bio, but do it in the form of Shakespeare. Or tell me a 150-word summary of what happened in Watergate for a middle school student, or stuff like that. And each answer was like, wow, that's pretty damn good. This thing is smart. So that was November 30th, 22, not very long ago. In 2023, you started seeing studies about it could pass the medical boards, it could pass the licensing test, it could pass the ABIM test and the boards in a variety of specialties. So that was okay, it's pretty damn smart. Then a little later in 2023, you started seeing studies of what happens if we pitch it like really hard cases, not 20-year-old person comes in with a sore throat and a runny nose, but like the cases you see in the New England Journal Clinical Problem Solvings, which are wild kind of showstopper kind of cases. And it turned out it did as well as faculty discussants who are specialists in the field in solving those cases. So that was like, okay, it's pretty damn smart. Then 2024, at that point it was like, okay, I can imagine how this thing's gonna be smarter than I am, even though I've been practicing medicine for 40 years and I've seen a whole lot, but I can imagine that it can know more than I do as a physician. But we have empathy and communications. And then a couple of studies began coming out rating AI versus physicians on empathy and communications, and it didn't do as well as we did, it did better. These were by blinded reviewers looking at the output of a conversation either between a patient and AI or a patient and a doctor. The reviewers didn't know which, and almost uniformly the conversations with the AI were judged to be more empathic and better communications, which sort of leaves me feeling like, okay, what do we have left that's just ours? I guess maybe not even billing, it's probably better at that. So. And then the study that Richard mentioned came out last year, which was AI by itself versus human with AI. And the fundamental theory of informatics, really from the days where you had AI playing against chess, was that it's good, humans are pretty good at stuff, but AI plus the humans will be better than either one alone. And there's a lot of happy talk in the world of AI, which is like, we're not here to replace the human doctor, nurse, lawyer, consultant, every field. We're not going to replace that. The doctor who uses AI will replace the doctor who doesn't use AI. That's most, and all the executives of the AI companies say that. You should know when you hear that, your BS detector should go crazy. Because they don't think that at all. They are quite confident, and they're all out there to try to replace that, because the economic value of their tool is much greater if they replace us than if they, quote, augment us. And I have a chapter in the book on a company called Hippocratic AI, where I think it's the only honest person. Such and I were arguing about other parts of his persona, but he's the only one who comes right out and says, yeah, my goal is to replace, at least in this case, nurses. So most people think that, but don't talk about that. Anyway, that's what I've been watching over the last 3 or 4 years, is basically the AI comes out and continues to demonstrate that it can meet milestones that a year earlier I would have said, no, it can't do that. Now, I want to show you, though, that human intelligence is also operating on a curve. And I've shown you really the wrong curve here, because it looks like mine is flat, but it's not. I'm 67 years old. It's actually going down. So, we are not getting any smarter as these tools just get better and better and better. And I think that curve is important to pay attention to, because, and we'll talk about hallucinations in a second, a lot of the stuff you hear about it, like, I can't use AI in my business because it hallucinates. Some of that came from 3 years ago, where it did a lot. And the tools are getting better and better, and some of the flaws in the tools are getting less and less. And so sometimes you'll hear these things and it really is, you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because people have an agenda about whether they do or they don't want this to take over their world. So how good is today's AI? By and large, I have found, and I know those of you who use this for clinical medicine, that it's pretty darn good. That when I ask it for a curbside consult, the answers I get, I would say, are at the level of a good resident. Maybe not quite a super specialist. If it's a tough cardiology question, I'd still call Dan before I would call it. But they're as good as you, and I don't call a cardiologist for every patient I see with a heart problem. Even better, I find, I use a tool called Open Evidence, which is now a startup that rather than ingesting all of the data from the entire internet, ingests basically the data in PubMed, the data from every medical society, and because all of the users are clinicians, vets the answers through its user base, and it's become much, much, much better. And I find that's kind of my go-to tool, including giving me references that are actually quite useful. Now, the answer that the kind of branding of the impression people had of GPT and other versions of generative AI were set a little bit in the first year, where any kind of new technology is always vulnerable to being branded as being bad because you have an N of one case, but it's newsworthy, everybody's looking for bad stuff. And so there were enough examples of problematic things that happened in that first year that I think it did set the field back, and I'll give you a couple of examples of them. One was this was Gemini, which was Google's tool, which when you asked it to show you pictures of the founding fathers, some of them were African American and just that were not correct. If you hear the rights war these days on, quote, woke AI, a lot of it comes from those early days where the tool was tuned to really be very sensitive to issues of equity and disparity, and came up with stuff like this. The Pope, they had a Pope that was a woman, all those sort of things that were just not correct. And so those don't happen anymore, but they certainly happened in the first year. Second one that happened was, this was another example of Google's AI tool that told you that if you really want to prevent your cheese from slipping off your pizza, you should use glue. To be fair, they did specify non-toxic glue, but they did say you should use glue. And another one, now I don't know about you, but I wasn't taught a lot about nutrition in medical school, but I don't think it's a good idea to be eating a rock a day, which is what one of the AI tools said you should do. So these became kind of the subject of jokes, and I think helped create an impression in many people's eyes that these tools aren't very good and certainly can't be trusted in anything super high stakes like medicine. This is sort of my list, and I have a chapter on all these in the book. One is on accuracy and trustworthiness, hallucinations being one of the problems, and probably the most visible and sort of caricaturizable problem, but not the only one. It's got another problem with what's called sycophancy, where you can give it an answer that's really stupid, and it'll say, oh, that's so smart, you're so brilliant, all tuned to make you want to use the tool more. As you may know, 2 years ago, prompt engineer was the most Googled job category of any job category. It was an incredibly popular thing. Every company needs to hire a prompt engineer. And I remember Jon Stewart did a segment on prompt engineers, and he said, I think we call that types question guy. He said, and if there's any job that could be replaced by AI, it's the types question guy. And it turned out within a year, the field of prompt engineers was dead, because the tools had gotten better. It no longer was so important to put in exactly the right prompt. Disparities and biases, the concern that AI will scale biases and will there be a digital divide, real concerns. Richard mentioned the black box question of like, how important is it that you understand how the AI came to its answer? Privacy and security issues, and obviously mis and disinformation. If you think about the stuff you probably all get on your phone now, where the AI now can produce a phishing attempt that no longer can you read it and say, oh, that was clearly written in another country, because it's perfectly decent English. And deep fakes mean that you could take my speaking at you and have me say anything and have it be totally believable. Here's my scorecard today on all of these things. Hallucinations are markedly down from where they were, and the things that I've showed you, the eating rocks, the founding fathers being black. Those don't happen anymore. It still is a problem, but it's a much lesser problem, and the tools are much more trustworthy than they were. Prompt engineering is dead. I think biases were overemphasized in the early days, in part because there was so much emphasis in society on issues of disparities. They were real, but they were no worse than the biases that humans have. In fact, all they were doing was scaling the biases that humans have, and humans have very real biases. There have been studies that showed that if you take a white patient and a black patient and they come to the ER with the same fracture, the white patient gets more pain meds. So that then, if the AI reads that, it will assume that's the right way to practice. And obviously, the current political climate is de-emphasizing a focus on that. The black box issue, people thought about that a lot. It turns out when it's been empirically tested, nobody really cares. Some of the early AI tools put a little button that you could click saying, give an explanation for how you came up with this answer. 3, 4, 5 years ago, people clicked on that a lot. And the empirical experience is nobody clicks on that over time. I have no idea how Tylenol works. I have no idea how anesthesia works. I use them because they work. They've been proven to work. They're certified by organizations that I trust. And I think that's going to be true in AI as well. This issue of explainability, I think, is going to turn out to be less important. The two, I think, that are very real are privacy and security concerns. Obviously, it's hackable like everything else, but if your AI is making decisions for you or running the pacemakers or adjusting the insulin dose, the consequences of those sort of problems are even greater than they were. And I think the biggest threat in healthcare is actually mis and disinformation. But the ones that sort of influence, would I want this thing involved in my healthcare organization today to help me take care of patients? I think those concerns are less than they were today. I think the tools are more trustworthy than they were. I like Ethan Mollick's rule. Ethan is a professor at Wharton who wrote a very good book called Co-Intelligence. And his Substack, if you just want to keep up with AI and the world of AI and what the new tools are doing, not healthcare specific, his Substack, which is called One Useful Thing, is as good as anything out there. His rule is assume that the AI you're using today is the worst you'll ever see. I think that's a fair assumption. So anything you thought about AI because you used it 2 years ago and it hallucinated, I think it's important to sort of put that a little bit aside and look at it today as you make decisions for your own organization. And the final quote I'll give you is, you've already heard a lot this morning, it's not like the AI has to be perfect to be better because the current system is so bad. And so this is, it became ironic over time, but Joe Biden liked to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And so as we think about AI's various use cases in healthcare, I think it's important to say, how well is the current system working? And the answer in almost every case is not working very well. So that's why I think Ferrugi is right. I think the tools are very powerful, getting better. Some of the problems are being mitigated. So let me spend a minute on the productivity paradox of IT. This is a term coined by a Stanford business professor named Eric Brynjolfsson in 1993. And the paradox was that and he was talking about what he calls general purpose technologies. So this is not a new radiology gizmo or cardiology gizmo. These are technologies that change the nature of the way we do everything. So what are examples of general purpose technologies? Electricity, the car, the internet, the computer, and now AI, generative AI. And the point that Eric made, and Eric spoke at this conference maybe 3 years ago, the point that Eric made was that in the history of these technologies, when they come out, they always get overhyped, they seem magical, they're going to change everything. And then the technology comes in and a year goes by or 2 years go by, sometimes 5 or 10 years go by and you don't see the promised benefits. And that's the paradox. The paradox is, why is it not working as well as we thought it should? Captured nicely by this Nobel Prize-winning economist who in 1986 said, you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. Meaning I go to the Wall Street trading floor, computers everywhere. I go to the factory, computers everywhere, but we're not seeing the benefits in productivity that we were promised. Why? And the answer, it turns out, and I liken this to a safe deposit box, is 2 keys have to turn, not just one. The first is obvious. The technology, version 1.0, is often not very good, has to get better. There's iteration, there's back and forth with the company. That's important. It turns out to be, in the history of general purpose technologies, not the main issue. The main issue is what Brynjolfsson calls reimagining the work, or what he calls complementary innovations, which is if you think this is all about the technology and we just have to put it in, you'll always get it wrong. It always is, how does the technology interact with the humans and the work and the business environment and the culture, and the technology may be very spiffy, but you have humans who are used to doing their work a certain way, and you got to somehow figure out how do you change the incentives and their training maybe, and maybe you need some different people, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen, and that's often what it takes to see the promised benefits. Now, the good news is that the productivity paradox pretty much always gets better if the technology is a keeper. So if you think about electricity, it took a while to rethink what a factory would look like to see the productivity benefits. Your car comes out, we had to train people about what this thing was. Henry Ford was reputed to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They had no idea what to do with this thing called a car until there were cars, and then there were roads. Think about the iPhone in the beginning. Who knew what that thing could do? So it takes some time. The good news is it usually gets better, but bad news is it often takes a number of years. So here's a short quote from the preface of my book where I tried to sort of capture this. I said, the story of whether AI will finally transform healthcare will mostly be about whether the system can implement the tools in ways that produce better outcomes for patients, lower costs, and some relief for beleaguered docs and nurses. And that in turn will be determined as much by history, politics, economics, pride, regulations, leadership, lawsuits, guilds, culture, workflows, inertia, greed, hubris, vibes, and zeitgeist as by graphical processing units, diffusion models, and neural networks. So that's the story here, is this is not just really a technology story, it's a business transformation story, which of course is real hard. Which then brings me to leadership. So what is leadership like in a health system in this era where, at least if you believe me, I'm saying you better think hard about these new technologies, how to implement them effectively, and it's not just about the tools themselves. Well, I think first of all, I think your people are already using this, even if you don't know that they are, or you haven't sanctioned it, or haven't built tools that allow them to use it effectively in your organization. What's the work of leadership? Here are just a few things, and it's a lot. I mean, it's pretty hard. Create an effective and nimble governance structure, including how do you solicit ideas from your people, how do you decide what are the use cases to focus on, how do you gain engagement without creating an unholy mess or having this governance structure just set up to say no all the time because, oh my God, we can't do this, security issues, compliance issues, blah, blah, blah. It's tricky, really tricky to do. I think every organization is thinking hard about this. Effective ones will be ones that sort this out. You've got to figure out how to analyze the ROI for different possible solutions and vet the potential tools. Let's get back to that in a second. You have to identify the skill gaps and train your staff. It's incredibly hard, particularly if they don't see the advantage or they're worried about what this means for them. You do have to address privacy and security concerns, and you have to create a system for monitoring. And one of the hard things about this is not just monitoring on day one, but monitoring on day 365. Because the tools will change over time, your conditions, your patient population may change, and a tool that worked perfectly well out of the box on day one may no longer be working well on day 365. So figuring out how to do that's important. I think the final challenge for health system leaders is this. You have to somehow, and do this with a straight face and feel authentic, manage your staff's anxiety and strike the delicate balance of making the case that the ROI comes from improving productivity while somehow making them feel they're not going to be out of work. And, I think everybody's got ideas about that. It's an incredibly tricky thing to do. I think our party line at UCSF is that we're growing really quickly, and it may prevent us from having to hire an extra 1,000 people, but nobody's going to lose their job. One executive of an AI company told me, he said, I've seen organizations where I go into where the CEO says to senior leaders, this is going to markedly improve our productivity by decreasing our headcount, and then walks to the next room and says to the staff, nobody's losing their job. How does that work? It's really tricky, and I don't think there's any easy answer to this, but that is the balance, and you have to understand that that your people have a lot of power in the organization, and if they are scared that this is going to take their jobs, it will influence their willingness to engage. Here are the National Nurses Association, which is the largest nurses union in the country, came out against non-trustworthy AI. And here they are picketing trust nurses, not AI. Two or three biggest strikes in the country over the last 2 or 3 years have been about AI job replacement. So managing this issue is something you got to start thinking about really hard. Lesson 3, begin in the proper quadrant. And the quadrant is of a 2x2 matrix that says risk and feasibility. So where do you want to start with your first AI tools? Well, you could say, I want to start on the hardest things to solve that have the highest risk. That would be kind of dumb to start on the things that are really hard and have really high risk. AI is not new in healthcare. In the 70s and 80s, there was an early AI movement. And the founding fathers, mostly guys at the time, decided to start on, any guesses what they started on, what their main use case was? It was diagnosis and clinical decision support. In retrospect, a really, really dumb decision, because the last place you want to start is the one where the stakes are the highest. There's going to be a screw up, bad stuff is going to happen, somebody's going to die, somebody's going to get sued, and the tools and it's really hard to replace the way doctors or other clinicians think. So here's a cartoon from the early AI days, rapid pulse, sweating, shallow breathing. The computer says, you've got gallstones, when this poor fellow has an arrow coming out of his back. That's not the right call. And I think we learned our lesson because AI basically went into hibernation in healthcare for 30 years, only to come back in the last couple of years. So where do you want to start? You want to start back office or relatively simple clinical problems, scribes, chart summarization, prior auths, billing and coding, but only in the most ethical way, scheduling and logistics, straightforward patient communications, things that are feasible, the risk isn't super high, and you get early wins and get early buy-in. So with that, the next thing I learned was really the importance of platforms, and this is, people of a certain vintage like me will remember this from The Graduate, where Dustin Hoffman's character, who's trying to figure out what to do for a living, goes to a party that his parents are throwing. One of his parents' friends comes up to him and says, you probably remember this, I have a secret. There's one word for you to remember, and remember the word? Plastics, right? That was I held my kids that, like, what do you mean plastic? What does that mean? So the word is platforms. The word in AI and for I think the foreseeable future is platforms. And by that, here's what I mean, that as you bring an organization up to speed in AI, you're not going to try to do everything. You can't solve 10 problems. You need to find a win, a quick win, solve an important problem, and that is how you get buy-in. And if you're a company, you've got to try to figure out, like, what is that use case that gets me in the door and establishes a relationship from which I then begin to build out. And that's the way things have played out in the last couple of years. So on their AI journey, health systems need to start with a win or two to gain buy-in and trust. So don't start with diagnosis. You start with something where you get everybody to say, oh, this is pretty cool. It actually is helping me. Nobody's losing their job. It's all good. If you're one of the companies, you also need an early win that allows you to build relationships, gain trust, and then pivot to more ambitious use cases. And my point here is if all you do as a company is that early win and you don't have anything else to sell, you're not going to be in business very long. And we're beginning to see that play itself out in the clinical workplace when it comes to scribes, and I'll come back to that in a second. This is Julie Adler-Milstein, who runs our Division of Clinical Informatics and Digital Transformations, really a national leader in IT and AI policy. So Julie said to me, the market is rewarding the unit of scale that is general enough to apply to a broad group of specialties, but also solves a very well-defined problem so you can put it in a budget somewhere. I think that's key. Like the first foray into this can't be boiling the ocean. It's like, what is a single problem that we can solve with a tool and get better at this, learn what it does, what it can't do, does it hallucinate, how do people accept it, what do I change in the workflow? And as I said, today's most common wedge is scribes. Let me spend a minute on scribes. How many of you are using scribes at your place? AI scribes? Just a few. That's interesting. I'm guessing this will be a question where if I ask it next year, half the hands will be up. So sometimes called ambient clinical intelligence. So let me first tell you, I had a very tiny, minor role in bringing scribes to national attention. When we first computerized 10 or 15 years ago at UCSF, I noticed that this documentation burden thing was beginning, and doctors were complaining about it. And a few places began hiring human scribes to come in and basically type while the doctor and the patient had an interaction. And I came home and said to my wife, honey, you know how every other industry computerizes and they immediately start laying people off. Only in healthcare could we figure out a way of computerizing and now bringing an extra person into the office, going from 2 to 3 people in the office to make this work. And I said, I think it's a story. So my wife writes for the New York Times, and so that's her. This is her article in the New York Times in 2014 called "A Busy Doctor's Right Hand Ever Ready to Type." So this is really the first time scribes came to national attention. And by the time 2022 rolled around, UCSF, our ambulatory practice, employed about 100 human scribes, mostly pre-med students on a gap year. And they were great, a little expensive, but the doctors who used them were really happy when we threatened to take them away. The doctors started crying because they actually liked the companionship too. They were a little bit lonely. That's not the way this problem will get solved in the future. So what has happened is a bunch of companies have come into the space selling AI scribes, meaning no longer a human doing the typing, your phone or some vehicle picking up a doctor-patient communication, and then it's not a transcript would be worthless. It has to then take it and turn it into what we call a SOAP note and understand the billing rules and the documentation rules. So here are 6 prominent companies, all funded by a fair amount of venture capital, who have entered this space. So from 2014 till 2022, if you wanted a scribe, you hired a human. By 2024, many companies entered the space. And what has happened is in the beginning, I'd say 2 years ago, I was like, wow, this is so cool. I can't believe companies can do this. Wow. And in the course of 2 years, it became a commodity. It became like, this is a no-brainer. It's like an easy thing for AI to do. Anybody could do it. And recently, in the last 2 weeks, OpenAI said, we're going to develop our own scribe product. And Doximity, which half the doctors in the country are on Doximity's platform, is offering its own scribe, and it's free. So talk about commoditization. You went from something costing probably $5,000 a year per doctor to now Doximity offering their tool for free. Brian Roberts, who runs a big VC firm, Venrock, said to me, scribes will not be a defensible moat, meaning that if that's your only business, you're going to get eaten by somebody else, and the commoditization means the price point is just going to go down and down. But scribes did turn out, at least in my estimation, to be a useful wedge, a useful first use case that would get buy-in from clinicians. And one of our docs said, I won't cry, but this is big. This is what I love to do, but I was thinking of quitting. I am so happy. There's never been a technology tool that we have put in place where people said that. This is kind of the first one that we've seen. And so solving kind of small bore problems like documentation, chart review, inbox answering, prior auths is important, but these are singles, not home runs. This is how this all gets started. And I really do think the scribe thing is going to become just everybody's going to have one in a few years, or you won't be able to hire or keep an outpatient doctor. So what's the ultimate destination? The ultimate destination is a platform. And I think what you're going to see is you begin with scribes, and then the tools are going to start reviewing the Moby Dick size chart for you. It will then do your billing and coding and prior authorization, and it will then begin suggesting diagnoses, not making them for you, but suggesting them, and then begin saying, well, if you think it's heart failure, here is the order set that we suggest that you use. So moving to diagnosis and decision support, but very late in the game after getting essentially the rest of the clinical environment. Why is decision support and diagnosis so important? The old saying is the most expensive piece of technology in any healthcare organization is the physician's pen. It's no longer the pen, it's now the keyboard. But doctors make 8% of healthcare's $5 trillion a year expenditures, but are responsible for 80% of the costs. because through our decisions. So this is really where this is all heading, but you don't want to head there first. I think that's inevitable that this will be the end game. So the final frontier, and I think the analogy of driverless cars is pretty good, that it didn't begin with a driverless car. It began with cruise control, and then started signaling you when you were leaving the lane, and then started signaling you when your head's bobbing. And the next thing you know, eventually it sort of packages all those things together into something that does a whole lot more. Why is decision support so hard? Why don't you want to start on it too soon? Errors are consequential. If you get it wrong and hurt somebody or kill somebody, bad, terrible, ethically, and also you may get sued. Clinicians have PTSD from alerts and alarms. Decision support implies that we know how to deliver information to the clinicians in a way that doesn't drive them crazy. We have not figured that out. Some tough choices around cost-quality trade-offs. And I think most clinicians have an allergy to cookbook medicine. And so if you hit them with the tools becoming too powerful and too prescriptive too soon, they will have antibodies to that and fight back. So if you want buy-in, you've got to go slowly, thoughtfully, carefully, and think a lot about history and culture. Now, there's one other decision. So I've talked a lot about the decision of where you start, which tool to start with, which use case to start with. There's another big decision, which is, do you buy from your EHR vendor, or do you buy from a company that's building a tool to solve a certain problem? I think that turns out to be one of the most interesting kind of business decisions here. So I'm talking about a platform like a scribe company, like a Bridge, branching out from scribes to chart review to eventually they just signed a deal with UpToDate. So you know that they're going to eventually be providing diagnoses and decision support. But you already have a platform, and that's your electronic health record, which does all transactions at your organization. So I'm guessing you won't have a make or buy decision. You'll mostly have a buy versus buy decision, whether to buy from your EHR vendor or to buy from an AI-specific company. And you'll have work to do. And the make part is all the other things you need to do. Customizing it around your own data, your workflows, testing it, all the change management and the monitoring over time are all absolutely critical. An organization like mine, which is a $10 billion healthcare organization with a lot of people that study this stuff, we'll do some making, but even in our organization, we project that maybe 10% of the AI that we will do will be stuff that we create. 90% we will buy from somebody, and the question is, do we buy it from Epic or do we buy it from one of the third-party vendors? Epic is developing AI tools for everything, and it doesn't sound like many of you have Epic, but if you do, they are. I'm sure that Oracle, which is now Cerner, and the other companies are doing the same. And we have a little bit of the old, if you remember the old days in technology, there was a saying, nobody ever lost their job going with IBM. Going with your EHR vendor is the safe choice. You know they're going to be in business in 5 years. You know that it's going to integrate with your EHR. And Epic, one of the people who works in this field said to me, Epic is like the kid who licks all the cookies before the friends arrive at the birthday party. So Epic is touching every single one of these use cases you can think of. They'll have a big splashy thing at their yearly conference. And then, oh, by the way, it won't be out for 2 years. But the goal is to freeze all of the startups that are trying to develop tools like that. But what are the disadvantages of working, and I know the Epic's tools rather than others, they're not very good, as you might expect from a company that's not an AI company, it's an EHR company. So there's going to be a tension where the tools are probably better if they're developed by a company that does that for a living, but are they going to be in business in 5 years? You've got to integrate it with your EHR. So that is, in some ways, the biggest business tension in this field. In many industries, the platform of record, so the question is like, will Epic go out of business? And the answer is no, I think. But the platform of record, where all the data is stored, is not the platform that frontline users interact with. The example that's classically given is in the aviation industry, where and I understand United Airlines went down today or something, so it's not perfect, but all of the information about scheduling and all that stuff is in a system that was built 50 years ago called Sabre, but nobody interacts directly with Sabre. They always are interacting. If you checked into a flight 40 years ago and you saw all those keystrokes, that's what that was. But nobody does that today. So the wrapper that you use when you go onto United.com or Delta.com is something that's built on top of Sabre. And I think the projection is that's what happens to Epic or it happens to Oracle over time. All right, last couple of minutes. Will there be doctors? Anybody who know who this is? All right, so this is Jeff Hinton, who's considered the founding father of modern AI, won the Nobel Prize for it a year or two ago. And this was Jeff Hinton at an AI conference in Toronto in 2016. If you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff but hasn't yet looked down. So it doesn't realize there's no ground underneath him. I think we should stop training radiologists now. It's completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning is going to be better than radiologists. So when this came out, I don't know if you know that, when this came out, radiology applications, which had always been sky high, completely tanked. Everybody, this is like Warren Buffett selling your stock short. It's like, oh my God, I got to get out of this. And 2 or 3 years later, med students are very smart. It's like, wait a second, the average radiologist is still making $500,000 a year, and it looks like they're pretty happy. And all of a sudden, boom, it completely skyrocketed again. Now, this is kind of dumb thing for Hinton who have said, but I have to say, if you'd asked me 10 to 15 years ago, which comes first, the radiologists are toast, or I am willing to get in the back seat of a car with no driver and make a left turn on Divisadero Street in San Francisco, I would have said, sorry, I would have said you're toast. I mean, it seemed like that was an easier problem than a driverless car. Has anybody taken a Waymo yet? Raise your hand if you've taken a Waymo. If you haven't and you find yourself in San Francisco, do it. It's like an amazing experience. So I take a Waymo about once a week. And at UCSF, in the same tech-obsessed city, we cannot hire enough radiologists. If you want a job, we got one for you, like tonight. So, I mean, how did that happen? It's crazy. But the lesson is, even in, quote, easy fields to replace by AI, like radiology and pathology, it's harder than tech folks believe. I think your chief, Michael, of neuroradiology said to me, I can teach a 16-year-old to drive in a day. I can't teach them to do neuroradiology in a day. Maybe it takes a couple of days to do neuroradiology. So I believe, and I actually think this turns out to be one of the reasons I think this is going to work out surprisingly well in healthcare, that AI will not displace many doctors or nurses for the foreseeable future because there are so many massive unmet needs that the AI will help us at least come close to meeting the needs, as opposed to what we have typically done, which is just hire, boatloads of more humans. Nurse practitioner, prior auth writers, care coordinators, all that sort of stuff. But I don't think nurses or doctors' jobs are going to be threatened in the 10-year time horizon. Beyond that, who knows? But I think for the foreseeable future, I think that's very important. If doctors felt like their jobs or nurses felt like their jobs would be lost because of AI, they would fight this like hell, and they're very good at it. They will not say, I'm worried about this because it's going to take my job. They will say, this will kill people, and people will believe them. So I think politically, part of the reason I think this is actually going to go reasonably well is because I don't think there will be that much job loss among the politically powerful groups. I do think in call centers and billing departments and prior auth generators, I do think there will be significant job losses. All right, so I'm going to I'm going to read you the last 3 pages of my book. This will take 2 minutes. You'll be the first people to have ever heard this. I'm going to do the audiobook, so I hope I can read this okay. Toward the end of my time on the wards, I cared for a 22-year-old woman with severe autism who was nonverbal at baseline. She was brought into the ER by her mother for fever, cough, and lethargy. In her case, the diagnosis of pneumonia was straightforward, as was the choice of treatments, IV fluid and standard antibiotics. I had no doubt that AI could have easily replaced my clinical decision-making. Still, and perhaps I'm being selfish, I treasure having been part of this young woman's care. As she emerged from her near coma, her mother's face brightened as she proudly told us that her daughter was back to her, quote, sassy self. Thinking of my own experience as a parent, I tried to put myself in this mom's place. I was awed by her resilience, her ability to find delight in loving a child who would never speak a word, for whom life's conventional milestones would always be out of reach. Lost in these thoughts, I turned to my patient, only a bit younger than my team of residents and students standing at her bedside. Just then, the patient flashed us a radiant smile and blew kisses to me and my team. As I hope I've made clear, I am convinced that AI's breathtaking and rapidly expanding capabilities will transform healthcare in ways we can barely imagine today, bringing enormous benefits to patient and clinicians and turning our healthcare system into one that for once functions reasonably well. By handling myriad administrative chores, allowing patients to accomplish many healthcare tasks independently, and permitting clinicians to be more capable versions of their professional selves, AI is poised to make our system better, safer, more convenient, and less expensive. But I am equally convinced that, particularly for patients with acute and complex chronic conditions, there will always be a need for a human guide, someone with not only deep medical knowledge and refined clinical judgment, but also the emotional intelligence to recognize and address a patient's unspoken fears, the leadership skills to orchestrate care across diverse teams, the patience and wisdom to navigate the inherent uncertainties of medicine and healthcare's bureaucratic cul-de-sacs, the uniquely human capacity for deep compassion that transcends both the practical and the algorithmic, and someone to be on the receiving end of a speechless patient's kisses. They will need a doctor. Thank you very much.